Everybody. My talk today, as Jeffrey said, is pro-choice and pro-life, politics and awe. And the important tension that I want to explore today is simply that I worry that my expression of awe over the reproductive process could be used to limit the right of women to control their bodies. I want to speak out to defend the right of women to have access to legal and safe abortions, but I also want to be able to speak out freely about the incredible natural process of human reproduction, from egg and sperm to conception to gestation to birth. So can I do that? It proved a lot harder than I thought. I'm going to start with simply the question of why speak about human reproduction at all. Well, as a humanist who is charged to inspire, I often talk about the wonders of science and nature. I share my own amazement at the stars above, the breath inside of us, the fragile ecosystem all around us. What better inspiration could there be than the process of bringing human beings into the world? It's amazing. It requires no supernatural God, no miracles. It's certified by science. It's praised by poets. Human reproduction is a source of awe and wonder from within naturalism. I remember feeling this awe back in 1983 when I first saw the Emmy Award-winning PBS Nova series episode entitled The Miracle of Life. There was, of course, no miracle in it, actually. It used state-of-the-art visual technology to portray the natural human reproductive process. It was inspiring. So what's the problem with sharing my awe and joy and wonder at the process of conception, gestation, and birth? Well, today's pictures and descriptions of fetuses in various stages of development is weighted with political subtext. They're used to constrict the rights of women. Since I initially intended this talk to be in honor of Mother's Day for my wife and my mother, it would be ironic to say the least if my words were twisted around to oppress women. But at the same time, I want to defend the right of people to choose and to acknowledge and gain strength from the awe, joy, and wonder of conception, gestation, and birth. So there's the tension. And then I have to deal with the issue of what is it to be a mother? This is a seemingly innocuous question, but it's complex. And it also carries potential for oppression. So for starters, I want to say first, obviously you don't have to bring a fertilized egg to term to be a mother, as the love and commitment of hundreds of thousands of women who have become mothers through adoption or foster care. And while I find gestation amazing, I don't want to imply that everybody with a womb should do it. Celebrating Mother's Day exclusively by focusing on the process of biological reproduction is shallow, and it's insulting to women who can't or who simply choose not to birth a child. More subtly, I want to make clear that I don't believe that mothering a child defines a woman either. First and foremost, women define women. A woman defines a woman. Some women define themselves in relation to raising a child, whether that child arrived on the scene through adoption or through birth. And many women offer their nurturance and love, and perhaps even mothering, to people independent of the birth process or childbearing. As the midwife of my children said in a program at the Washington Ethical Society, just about anybody can mother anybody, not just children. You can protect, soothe, guide, and nurture other people as expressions of your belief in their inherent worth. So is focusing on birth or child rearing too narrow for a Mother's Day talk? Maybe it goes too far. Maybe not. So I tentatively proceed. But a more fundamental problem arises because I am a man. Now, given the subtext of centuries of patriarchal oppression, what the hell am I doing pontificating about biological reproduction? I'm not a mother. I'm not a potential mother. My perspectives on the biological process of reproduction is less direct than, oh, say, more than half the human race. So what makes me think that I have anything special to say? We need another male expert on women, like we need a hole in the head. That's in part why I sought the wisdom of many women in working on this talk. I quote a lot of women in this talk. And that's why I urge you to come here next week to hear Sharon Wallace speak about the issue of abortion next Sunday. I mean, can men even imagine what it's like to be pregnant? Can they judge in any way the issue of abortion? The woman who wrote Nickel and Dime, Barbara Ehrenreich, is right when she said, if men were equally at risk from this condition, if they knew their bellies might swell as if they were suffering from end-stage cirrhosis, that they would have to go through nearly a year without a stiff drink, a cigarette, or even an aspirin, that they would be subject to fainting spells, that they would be unable to fight their way onto commuter trains, then I am sure that pregnancy would be classified as a sexually transmitted disease, and abortions would be no more controversial than emergency appendectomies. So, I'm going to proceed, but I humbly admit my own gendered and limited perspective on this. Obviously, I cannot speak for women. I can't even speak for my mother and my wife. But while I had two radically different perspectives on the birth process of these two wonderful women, I can say I was intimately involved in both. So now I want to draw on their strength for inspiration. So while I'm wrestling in my head about issues of identity and definition and labeling and voice, I now have to wander into the almost overwhelming issue of politics and abortion. So we mark the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, and the reproductive rights of women are under attack as they haven't been ever. Back in 1973, I thought the issue was settled by the Supreme Court's middle course on the issue. They cited the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, declaring that a woman's right to privacy gave her significant authority over whether or not to carry a fetus to term. Limiting her choice, said the court, was the state's right to protect prenatal life at the point at which the fetus was viable, potentially able to live outside the mother's womb. We're going to discuss many of these issues tomorrow night at the panel discussion, so please come. But the Roe v. Wade ruling was built on a 1965 decision involving a Planned Parenthood clinic from the town where I was born, New Haven, Connecticut. Because in Griswold v. Connecticut, the court overturned a 1879 law criminalizing advocating contraception. It took to the 60s to do that. The court specifically denied the fact that there was any restriction to the right to marital privacy. So Estelle Griswold, who was the executive director of the Planned Parenthood Clinic in New Haven and a doctor at Yale Medical School, they won a 7-2 decision, she and Dr. Buxton, affirming that privacy was a fundamental right. And a decade later, the Roe case used similar reasoning to defend a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy through abortion. So, almost immediately, Roe versus Wade becomes a center of controversy, and it keeps growing. Carl Sagan and Anne Druyan, two of my favorite naturalists, explained this in a 1997 article I'm going to read a portion of. They said, the issue had been decided years ago. The court had chosen the middle ground. You'd think the fight was over. Instead, there are mass rallies, bombings, intimidation, murder of workers at abortion clinics, arrests, intense lobbying, legislative dramas, congressional hearings, Supreme Court decisions, major political parties almost defining themselves on this issue, and clerics threatening politicians with perdition, partisans fleeing accusations of hypocrisy and murder. The intent of the Constitution and the will of God are equally invoked. Doubtful arguments are trotted out as certitudes. The contending factions call on science to bolster their positions. Families are divided. Husbands and wives agree not to talk about it. Old friends are no longer speaking. Politicians check the latest polls to discover the dictates of their consciences. And amid all the shouting, it's hard for the adversaries to hear each other. Opinions are polarized. Minds are closed. Sounds like today. Sounds like today. However, a recent Gallup poll shows that some people support Roe by a 53 to 29%, with 18% having no opinion. A Pew poll in January said support for Roe was at 60%. I've seen polls at 70%. And as a practice, abortion is common. It's practiced by people around the world, chosen by women of different faiths and backgrounds and classes. And although there's been a steady decline since 1981 of the number of abortions, Guttmacher Institute estimates that nearly 1 in 3 American women will have an abortion by the time they're 45. 88% of abortions are in the first trimester, generally the least controversial. Only 1% are in the third trimester. 70% of women obtaining abortions identify themselves as Christian. A majority of women of diverse backgrounds support choice, especially when it's framed as a civil rights issue. It is a civil rights issue. It's an issue of choice. Now, many people agree with Hillary Clinton, who said, "I have met thousands and thousands of pro-choice men and women. I have never met anyone who is pro-abortion." Nevertheless, the extremist rhetoric is just getting hotter, and reproductive rights are under assault. And ironically, the most vocal critics of abortion are also the ones who deny women the right to contraception, the most effective means to prevent abortion. Sagan and Druyan point out that by far the most common method for abortion control is worldwide birth control. So opponents of abortion should be out there handing out contraceptions, teaching school children how to use them. Ilse Hogue, who's the president of the National Abortion Rights Action League, points out that access to contraception is actually a huge part of this debate over Obamacare. 99% of all women, she says, use birth control in this country. So everyone should agree it's a good thing, right? Wrong. Because a few conservative ideologues who oppose all contraception for women are blocking women from receiving those benefits under Obamacare simply because of where they work. Hogue points out also that there are current budget cuts that are hitting women from poorer backgrounds much harder. They don't have as much access to family planning. Many wait weeks for an appointment at a clinic right now. And NAREL estimates that 750,000 women from low-income backgrounds could be turned away from the federal women, infant, and children programs in the next 6 months. So opponents of access to abortion can credit their success, ironically, to a 1989 decision upholding Roe v. Wade. Webster v. Reproductive Health Service, to Justice Scalia's great disappointment, did not overturn Roe v. Wade, but what it did do is it gave states the right to pass bans on abortion. Now, Abby Scher, who's a member of the Brooklyn Ethical Society, explains this really well in her current cover article in the Progressive, Anti-Abortion Forces on the March, which I scooped beforehand to put a selection in the Ethical Action Report of the American Ethical Union. But Abby and I talked a little bit last week, and she talked about how opponents of abortion are really looking at ways to block it on a state-by-state level. She quotes in her article a couple of people, one person from Americans United for Life, that are overwhelming state houses around the country with bills restricting abortion. Charmaine Yost, who's the executive director of America's United for Life, says, "For us, it's very much a military strategy. Never attack where the enemy is strongest," which is in fact in national polls. Okay? Never attack where the enemy is strongest. We pick our battles. What we do is very much under the radar screen. We can't let that be under the radar screen any longer. NAREL admits that the strategy is very effective. Tens of thousands of low-income women in Texas are now unable to get various options because the state funding has been cut from Planned Parenthood in that state. The New York Times reported in March that Arkansas has what is by far the country's most restrictive ban on abortion recently passed. North Dakota, the governor described his own anti-abortion law as to discover, its purpose was to discover the boundaries of Roe v. Wade. Well, the boundaries are being tested now. A lot of the right's power in this is because of the effectiveness of how they frame the debate. We've had discussions here about that. Deborah Rowland, in her book, The Boundaries of Her Body, The Troubling History of Women's Rights in America, noted that this shift of language orchestrated by the right is now affecting court decisions. Over the last 20 years, the term fetus, the term used in Roe v. Wade, is slowly being replaced by the term unborn child. Accordingly, there are laws now being passed against what's called fetal abuse. Even though Roe defines a fetus as a non-person until birth, you now read court records discussing prenatal child abuse, even though, according to Roe, there's no such thing as a prenatal child. Now, part of this is that with improved visual technology and images of fetal development are used effectively by Roe opponents. Ed Rivet, who's the legislative director of Michigan Right to Life, says that ultrasound technology complicates the debate. He says, they have wiggly fingers and toes. That whole it's a blob tissue, that's long gone. Lori Garcia, who's a professor at Boston College and part of the Faculty for Life, says, with all the videos of sonograms, how long can Roe v. Wade withstand these kinds of things? So what seems clear to me is that as we peer more closely into the womb of a woman, the woman disappears. Rosalind Paczewski, who wrote Abortion and Woman's Choice, says that as the privacy curtain is pulled back, the birth process becomes less owned by the pregnant woman. She becomes objectified and more subject to control from the outside. She says, these technologies, by their very existence, deprivatize the womb. It's no longer a woman's private space, and she is no longer the only one, or even the main patient in the obstetrical situation. So without private space, without the sanctuary of privacy carved out by Roe v. Wade, simplistic extremists just rush in and define for themselves what's right and wrong. Contemporary extremists are obviously aided by centuries of misogyny and oppression and objectification of women. It's much too grand a topic to explore today, but I'm going to return to what I was talking about earlier about framing and defining what is a woman. Many women are still denied the right to define their own sexuality. Everybody is, to that degree, but women in particular. Women's sexual pleasure is either denied or it's exploited. Many still preach that a woman's role is to give birth, and that the suffering inherent in that is some sort of contribution to the current good. One author said that we still find the, quote, Augustinian image of women as ordained by God to procreate, the passive receptacle of the male seed, selfish and sinful as she evades the destiny and directs her sexuality to non-procreative ends. It's still going on. And it's affecting court decisions. There's this specter that progressives have talked about women being portrayed as vessels with no individual rights, obligated to carry the state's children. Women who choose not to bring a fetus to term are painted as selfish or callous. Rowland notes one, actually, Philadelphia Supreme Court decision that heard of a malpractice case of a woman who lost a baby in a miscarriage. The doctor's lawyer, in fighting this suit, used the fact that the woman had had an abortion earlier in her life as evidence that she could not have cared much about the miscarried fetus. So why allow her to sue the doctor? Now the jury agreed with the defense's claim that, quote, if the plaintiff placed so little value on the fetus, then the level of emotional distress should not be the same for that woman had she valued the fetus all through the pregnancy and never contemplated an abortion at any stage. Now that is diabolical reasoning. It's seductive on the surface, it's effective legally, but it denies the women the right to negotiate their own unique organic life situation. And it's going on all over. The pro-life side, as they strategically label themselves, right, often portray women as seeking abortion as evil or corrupted or broken or untrustworthy. And they see the complex decision as black and white, as either fetus or mother. Mary Kay Blakely wrote in the New York Times, the pro-life side picks fetuses because they have little confidence in the moral judgment of women. These women, after all, have gotten themselves pregnant, as one state legislator put it. As if no man was involved. They have obviously sinned, and they're deserving of punishment. A fetus, on the other hand, is virginal and pure. So it is even in the hearts of some confirmed feminists, according to Christina Locke in another op-ed story in the Times. She says that shifts in language and culture have made liberals uncomfortable discussing abortion rights, especially from a personal perspective. Locke writes, "We went from basking in the rights that feminism had afforded us to silently pledging that we would never exercise them. Nice mommies don't talk about abortion." Similarly, this also, I think, silences liberals and progressives from talking about the wonders of human reproduction. It's time for liberals to talk more openly about this. We have been battered on the public relations front. Advocates for choice can no longer allow the right-wing simplistic thinking to dominate. For example, we no longer can allow the right wing alone to use the visual technology to their advantage. Our ability to understand the photographic and reproductive process should not be used exclusively by anti-choice extremists to shock the public into intolerance for the complexities of life. From a rational and humanist perspective, polarized thinking makes for dramatic politics but lousy policy. And that's the thinking behind Planned Parenthood's new campaign called "Not in Her Shoes." Abortion is described on their website as, quote, "deeply personal and often complex decision for all women to make. You can't make that decision for someone else. Nobody knows a woman's specific situation. We're not in her shoes." That's right. Destiny Robinson, who's quoted on that webpage, says, "I think that the labels pro-choice and pro-life put people in boxes. Abortion is not a boxed-in issue. It's a very complex issue. It has a lot of different parts of it." Part of the Planned Parenthood campaign encourages more sophisticated dialogue as a side box saying it's not a black and white issue. As humanists, we know this. Life is complicated. That's part of what Druyan and Sagan were trying to say in a 1997 article that they titled "Abortion, Is It Possible to Be Both Pro-Life and Pro-Choice?" They write this: "In contemplative moments, nearly everyone recognizes that the issue is not wholly one-sided. Many partisans of differing views find some disquiet, some unease when confronting what's behind opposing arguments. This is partly why such confrontation is avoided. The issue surely touches on deep questions. What are our responses to one another? Should we permit the state to intrude into the most intimate and personal aspect of our lives? Where are the boundaries of freedom? What does it mean to be human?" We have to start talking about these things, asking the bigger questions. We have to have the issue of reproductive choice placed in the context of a whole lifetime of complicated decisions and challenges. Sagan and Druyan ask how it is that we can get so wrapped up into the issue about the issue of aborted fetuses no bigger than an olive when they say this, quote, "That right to life eludes 40,000 children under 5 who die on our planet each day from preventable starvation, dehydration, disease, and neglect." That's complicated. They also question the nearly fanatical embrace of conception as the starting point for life. Sagan and Druyan say, "Despite many claims to the contrary, life does not begin at conception. It's an unbroken chain that stretches back nearly to the origin of the earth 4.6 billion years ago. Nor does human life begin at conception. It's an unbroken chain dating back to the origin of our species, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Quote, "Every human sperm and egg is beyond the shadow of a doubt alive. They are not human beings, of course. However, it could be argued that neither is a fertilized egg." Things are complicated. That's why we must defend a woman's right to choose. Now, things seemed a lot simpler to me back in '83 when I saw that first Miracle of Life film for the first time. I thought Roe v. Wade had settled things. To me, there was no miracle involved, no contentious debate. Maybe I was too young, blind, and male to see the complexities. I let the trance-inducing music of the video and the soft voice of the narrator wash over me as it talked about the amazing process of the development of the fetus. The final portion of the film impressed me the most. You can go online and see it. See the last 10 minutes and nothing else. There are time-lapse images of various stages from the egg to the 4-cell zygote to the 10-day-old blastocyst implanted embryo, 1/10 of an inch long. It details the growth of arm buds, the beginning of the eyes, the visible spine by 6 weeks as it grows to half an inch in length. At 10 weeks, according to the narrator, the 2-inch long embryo, still with a tail stub, is then considered a fetus. By 16 weeks old, its internal organs are nearly completely formed, and it's actively turning inside the mother. Now stop. You notice anything peculiar? I have just been describing, and the video just described, up until the 16th week, the process without mentioning the mother. I watched the film again to see if that was really what I saw, and it's true. There's almost this disembodied nature of pregnancy. From the moment of conception up until 16 weeks of development, this groundbreaking film spoke of the fetus without saying the word mother. It mentioned the uterus, the placenta, the fluid-filled embryonic sac, but by focusing on the fetus, the mother disappeared. In every stage of development, in this amazing process, the mother is obviously deeply and intimately involved, and yet in this relatively non-political, innocent film, she was nearly invisible for much of the beginning of the pregnancy. In the final minute of the film, they take you into the delivery room where you do see the mother giving birth, that's true. But I was stuck at how mesmerized I was, how the video was so focused, myopically, on the fetus. And it's easy to be mesmerized by that. It's easy to call it a miracle when it's not. Especially if you're a man trying to figure it out from the outside. I recently read an interesting blog in the Huffington Post about a guy named Alexander Tsiaris, who was founder and editor-in-chief of thevisualmd.com, a visual technology company. And he said, I have spent most of the last decade focusing on the marvels of developmental biology, the study of how multicellular organisms develop from immature forms into adults. It's almost impossible to express how privileged I felt to watch the process of conception to birth. In my earlier days, I marveled at this symbiotic relationship that the developing child and mother shared. The symbiotic relationship is often lost in the battle to control a woman in defense of the innocent fetus. This intimate relation between women and fetus is underappreciated. It's somehow written out of the picture quite often. And it leads to denying women the right to control their bodies. And it denies the importance of relationship. That's fundamental to ethical humanism. Human beings are not simply autonomous actors negotiating relationships. The relationships are who we are. And what more intimate a relationship than between a fetus and a mother? Paczewski, in her book, writes about this. She says, what it means to be a human involves an irreducible social or relational basis, without which the very concept of humanity makes no sense. It is this relationship, this interdependence, that humanizes us. Supporters of reproductive rights must resist this dehumanization of women that happens when the fetus is held distinct from and often superior to the woman. Motherhood is about relationship, intimacy, identity, and privacy. Paczewski says, reducing motherhood to a passive biological state in a way dehumanizes it, stripping it of the dependence on women's consciousness. The right to life position, she says, denies the role of human will and judgment in moral decision-making, particularly in decision-making about childbirth and sex. It thus denies the full human personhood of women. That consciousness emerging out of reciprocal sensory activity marks the beginning of the social relationship that are necessary as the sole basis from which the fetus develops into a self. It's humanization. Ellen Willis, a feminist writer, says that the process of birth can't be separated from the conscious decisions of the mother. She writes, there is no way a pregnant woman can passively let the fetus live. She must create and nurture it with her own body, a symbiosis that's often difficult, sometimes dangerous, and uniquely intimate. It's simply insulting and demeaning to deny women the right to decide whether to bring life into this world. Roe versus Wade has been the best defense of those rights, and it should not be overturned. So I'm going to continue to fight for a woman's right to choose. I'll continue to defend the inherent worth of all women and support their reproductive decisions over their own life. And this is not an easy responsibility that women have chosen. It has been forced upon them by the facts of life. Which is another reason why everybody who cares about the rights of women should stand in solidarity with NARAL, Planned Parenthood, and perhaps only when the rights indicated in Roe v. Wade are not being threatened will defenders of choice be able to comfortably draw inspiration from this amazing process of human reproduction. So I urge you to read the article in The Progressive by Abby Shear. I urge you to fight for the rights of women to choose. Thank you very much.